Hello everyone, I'm Ixalan, and welcome back to Ixalan Limited Review Week. Yesterday I talked about all the white cards in Ixalan, and today I'm continuing with blue. If you want to know how I grade these cards, you can find a link in the description below to a grading guide, and just a reminder as always, these grades are all based on my impressions of the card before actually playing with them, and I hope they help you prepare for your pre-release and first drafts, but obviously grades on these cards are going to change over time. But let's go ahead and get started with the first blue card, which is one we've seen a lot of, Aerialist. Aerialist is 3 generic and 2 blue for a 4/4 elemental at uncommon that has flying. 5 mana 4/4 flyers are usually something that only blue gets, and they are very powerful, usually among the best uncommons for blue in a given set if they're at uncommon. And that's what Aerialist basically is and always is. It doesn't do anything fancy, but it can kill your opponent in the air quickly and is aggressively costed. I'm going to give it a B-. It is first pickable in some packs. Next we have Arcane Adaptation, which is 2 generic and a blue for a rare enchantment, and it says, as Arcane Adaptation enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Creatures you control are the chosen type in addition to their other types. The same is true for creature spells you control and creature cards you own that aren't on the battlefield. This is an interesting card. There are 2 tribes that really overlap into blue, merfolk and pirates. This card will normally not be playable, but in some strange situations it could actually be pretty good. Like if you have a bunch of payoffs for either pirates or merfolk, but not enough actual pirates or merfolk. But that isn't something that is just going to happen in drafts regularly. I just don't want to say that this is entirely unplayable, because there will certainly be occasions where it makes sense to put in your deck. But in most cases, even if you're a pirate or merfolk deck, the majority of the creatures in your deck probably already have that creature type, and as a result, this isn't normally worth it. It's about an F, but I do sort of have a second grade here of C to reflect the fact that sometimes maybe you end up with a bunch of payoffs, but not enough actual creatures of whatever type. Alright, the next card is Cancel, another reprint, 1 generic and 2 blue. It's an instant at common, and it says counter target spell. It's usually not a good idea to mainboard this card anytime we've ever seen it, though I do think it is a little more mainboardable in this format because it's filled with high curve creatures like dinosaurs, and that means you can counter things well into the late game, meaning it's not a bad draw in the late game. It is more of a sideboard card, though. It's just too costly of a counterspell. Leaving up 3 mana is way too much, but if your opponent has some scary bombs, don't hesitate to side it in. I think it's about a D in your main board and a C out of your sideboard. Next, we have Chart a Course, which for 1 generic and 1 blue is an uncommon sorcery that says draw 2 cards, then discard a card unless you attack with a creature this turn. This is a pretty good indication of something interesting with blue this time around. It seems to be an aggressive color. It's doing things that blue normally does, like drawing cards, but it gives you a bonus if you attacked. And this is some pretty powerful card draw. 2 mana to draw 2 isn't something we see a lot of these days. Black gets it sometimes, but they have to pay life for it. Some of the time you'll have to discard 1 card, but if you've activated Raid that turn, which is a mechanic where you get a bonus if something attacked that turn. Interestingly, this doesn't have Raid, but it basically is Raid. But you basically just straight up draw 2 cards if you attacked. You will play this in any blue deck with a decent number of creatures, as it is always a 2-for-1 in those decks. I still wouldn't take it ultra early, but I would be happy picking it up around mid-pack. I think it's about a C+. Next, we have Daring Saboteur, who for 1 generic and 1 blue is a 2/1 human pirate at rare, and for 2 generic and 1 blue, it can make itself unblockable, and it also has, when Daring Saboteur deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. If you've watched a lot of my content over the years, you know I'm a sucker for creatures who let me draw cards, even if it's only looting, but I'm going to try to reel in my excitement about this card. It is a 2 mana 2/1 with the relevant pirate creature type. That has some serious upside. It can make itself unblockable, which already means that this is a 2-drop that is relevant at all stages of the game, since it can be impossible to interact with in combat in the late game, but it also lets you loot anytime you hit your opponent. All of those things make this a pretty powerful card, and one I'm willing to take early, even with my first pick in a pack lacking premium removal or a bomb, and I'm going to just give this a B. I think people are going to underrate this card, but they're going to quickly find that making it so this creature can attack at all stages of the game with its activated ability and helping you dig deeper in your deck is actually quite powerful. Next, we have Deadeye Quartermaster, who for 3 generic and 1 blue is an uncommon 2/2 human pirate, and it says, when Deadeye Quartermaster enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an equipment or vehicle card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. This card is reminiscent of cards like Trophy Mage and Trinket Mage. Like with those, it is good if you can draw a card with it the majority of the time. Don't play this in a deck if you have 0 equipment or vehicles, as a 4 mana 2/2 is unplayable. However, if you even have just 1 equipment or vehicle, this pushes into the playable territory, probably around C-. And if you have 2 or more vehicles or equipment, you are really increasing the chances that you will get to draw a card when you play the Quartermaster. And with that many or more cards to search for, I think the Quartermaster gets into the C+ range, but it's an F. Don't play it if you don't get the right kinds of cards that it can search for. And if you can get cards that it can search for, you should play it. It's a solid card. Next, we have Deep-Root Waters, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon enchantment, and it says, whenever you cast a Merfolk spell, create a 1/1 blue Merfolk creature token with hexproof. Another obvious build around, Deep-Root Waters is basically unplayable if your deck has 3 or fewer Merfolk, basically an F. However, if you get to about 7, it pushes into the C range, and I think 10 or more pushes this to a B-. If you can basically put a 1/1 token with hexproof into play to the majority of your creature spells, that's an insane card. I think this is a big enough payoff that in some packs I would be willing to take it early to see if Merfolk are open, especially if that pack is weak. But even if you do that, you have to be willing to abandon it if Merfolk just aren't coming together for you. But it is like a B in a deck that really gets there on Merfolk, and it's going to win a lot of games in that way. Next, we have Depths of Desire, which is 2 generic and a blue for a common instant that says, return target creature to its owner's hand. Create a colorless treasure artifact token with tap, sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Treasure is something we're going to see a lot of in this video. We didn't see it at all in yesterday's white doesn't make treasure, but blue does. Bounce spells frequently give you some nice value, either because you bounced a creature with an aura on it, or who a trick or other effect was being used on, or because you bounced something that costs far more than the bounce spell did, like a 6-drop. This gives you even more value since it also helps you fix and ramp, meaning you come out way ahead on mana most of the time you cast this. This is a solid common for blue at C+. Next we have Dive Down, which for 1 blue is an instant that says target creature you control gets +0/+3 and gains hexproof until end of turn. Tricks like this aren't very good. You want to boost power with a trick, not usually toughness. Your creature has to have enough power to take down the creature it is blocking or being blocked by to give you at least a trade. There's no reason to use this just so your creature survives. And yes, this can allow you to effectively counter a removal spell, and leaving 1 mana up for that isn't a huge deal, but honestly I'd rather just have another creature in my deck than this thing. It will frequently sit in your hand and be useless, either because your opponent is just out aggroing you and this does not let you punch through their creatures at all, or they never play removal when you leave blue up. This is pretty much unplayable and I'm going to give it an F. Next is Dreamcaller Siren, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a 3/3 Siren Pirate at rare. It has flash and flying. It can only block creatures with flying, but it also says when Dreamcaller Siren enters the battlefield, if you control another pirate, tap up to 2 target non-land permanents. A 4-mana 3/3 with flash and flying, and the pirate creature type is already good enough to get this to a B-, but this comes with some additional upside. If you have another pirate, you get to tap down 2 non-land permanents. The most common thing you'll do with this, unfortunately because it can't block anything but flyers, is just flash this in at the end of your opponent's turn to tap down their guys. This also means you can leave mana up for like card draw spells, counter magic, removal, and if you don't have to use those, you can just flash the Siren in. So you do get some advantage out of flash, but unless your opponent has a flyer, you're not going to be able to flash this in to kill a creature by blocking. But that's a pretty good card. If you get to tap down 2 of your opponent's best creatures, when you flash this in, you also have a 3/3 flyer who is going to quickly kill your opponent in the sky. It's also a pirate. So if your deck is pirate heavy, I think this gets all the way up to a B+. I think this is a very first pickable card. It has a high ceiling and a high floor, and I'm happy to have it in any deck, but a pirate deck can really abuse it. Next, we have Entrancing Melody, which for X and 2 blue is a rare sorcery that says, gain control of target creature with converted mana cost X. Mind control effects are among the most powerful things in all of Magic. We've had some pretty good ones lately, like Kefnet's Last Word and the one that used energy from Aether Revolt. They are powerful because they are basically premium removal spells in that they get rid of your opponent's creature and give it to you, making it a really good removal spell. Unfortunately, this one does not quite reach their level of power. Having to pay a creature's converted mana cost to steal it means that the best thing to do with a mind control effect, steal your opponent's huge creature, is going to be very expensive. It does mean you can do something silly like steal a creature token for only 2 mana, but this is an Amonkhet block. Creature tokens aren't going to be all over the place. This is still a playable card for a blue deck. I'm not trying to say it's not. I'm just trying to tell you it is not a Kefnet's Last Word style, mind control style card. It's just requires too much mana. And yeah, there's treasure around in this format, so the X may be easier to get to than I'm thinking, but I wouldn't take this especially early, and I think it's just a solid C. I mean, I would play it in any blue deck, but I'm not going to really try to grab it. Next, we have another reprint, Favorable Winds. Lots of reprints in blue. 1 generic and 1 blue for an uncommon enchantment that says creatures you control with flying get +1/+1. This is a build-around we've seen before, and it is a powerful one, and one of my favorite build-arounds in a limited format, actually. An Anthem for all of your flyers is great, especially if your deck is made up primarily of flyers. This is basically unplayable with like 5 or less flyers, making it an F. But with 10 or more flyers, it will be one of the best cards in your deck, especially if you can get multiple copies. While this has a very, very low floor, the ceiling is incredibly high, and high enough for me that I'd be willing to first pick this and try to grab all the flyers I could. But if the flyers aren't coming your way, be ready to jump ship. But it is like a B when you can get there with flyers. Next, we have Fleet Swallower, which is 5 generic and 2 blue for a 6/6 fish at rare. And it says, whenever Fleet Swallower attacks, target player puts the top half of his or her library rounded up into his or her graveyard. I feel kind of bad for this card because it was one of the cards that was on the rare sheet that got spoiled really early, and nobody could make out what it was, but people thought it was like a 5 mana 4/6. That's what a lot of the spoiler sites were saying. And then when the whole spoiler got revealed, this is what we got. The text, people got the text right on the card, but a 6 mana 4/6 with this text is so much better than a 7 mana 6/6 with this text. In a set filled with large creatures, Fleet Swallower does not measure up well. 7 mana for a 6/6 just isn't good enough in this format. And yeah, milling half of your opponent's library is pretty nice, but milling is not a very impactful effect, at least not until your opponent runs out of cards. It doesn't help your board position or anything. Sometimes decks will be desperate for a top curve threat and play this, but you can do way better and at lower rarities. He's just a D. Next, we have Headwater Sentries, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 2/5 Merfolk Warrior at common. This is sort of the classic definition of a D. A 4 mana 2/5 isn't something you want to put in your deck, but sometimes you'll be low on creatures or have a bunch of Merfolk synergies and not enough Merfolk, and this will make the cut. Most of the time you don't want to play this though. I'm going to give it a D+. Next we have Herald of Secret Streams, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 2/3 Merfolk Warrior. It says, and it's rare, and it says creatures you control with +1/+1 counters on them can't be blocked. Yet another build around, Herald of the Secret Streams is pretty terrible in a deck without ways to put +1/+1 counters on things. The main home for this deck seems to be in decks where the Explore mechanic is featured heavily, which is mostly in blue-green, but black also has a good amount of Explore. I think you probably need about 7 cards that put +1/+1 counters on creatures before this becomes worth putting into your deck. It's an F, really, before you get there. But if you do get a critical mass of cards that do stuff with +1/+1 counters, you should be playing Herald of the Secret Streams, and it'll be one of the best cards in your deck. Don't take it too early. I don't think it's quite good enough of a payoff to take super early, especially because Explore isn't like 100% of the time going to give you a +1/+1 counter. But taking it, 3rd or 4th pick out of a weak pack seems reasonable to me. I'm going to give it a sort of a B- when you really get there, building around Herald of Secret Streams. Next, we have Jace, Cunning, Castaway, which is 1 generic and 2 blue for a legendary Planeswalker. If you weren't aware, Planeswalkers all now follow the legend rule, and you can have multiple Jaces in play if you want to, of different kinds of Jaces, that is. It's a mythic, and it starts with 3 loyalty. He has a +1 that says, whenever 1 or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player this turn, draw a card. Then discard a card. His -2 says, create a 2/2 blue illusion creature token with, when this creature becomes a target of a spell, sacrifice it, and he has a -5. Create 2 tokens that are copies of Jace, Cunning, Castaway, except they're not legendary. 3 mana Planeswalkers are notoriously powerful because if you get them into play on turn 3 and limited, a lot of time you're just going to win, and I think Jace, Cunning, Castaway is exactly that. His +1 allows you to make every one of your creatures loot when they do combat damage. Well, not everyone, but if one of your creatures does combat damage, you get to loot, is what I mean to say. And he has an interesting ultimate that really isn't all that hard to get to since he starts at 3 loyalty, making extra copies of himself. But his -2 is probably the thing that really makes him so good. He can start making illusion tokens. Now, granted, he has to lower his loyalty to do this, but it's not that hard to sort of alternate turns and be looting and then make illusion tokens that can protect him. And if you play him on turn 3 and make an illusion token, your opponent's going to have a very hard time getting through to Jace. He holds on to usefulness in the late game too, since he can make creature tokens and help you loot to improve the quality of cards in your hand. He's an A. He's just a very good Planeswalker. I'll be happy to open him in a pack, and you should be too. Next, we have Kepala, Warden of Waves. 1 generic and 2 blue for a 2/2 legendary creature Merfolk Wizard at rare. And it says, spells your opponent's cast that target a Merfolk you control cost 2 more to cast. And abilities your opponents activate that target a Merfolk you control cost 2 more to activate. By itself, this is a 3-mana 2/2 that is a little harder to kill with spells, and it's a merfolk. Those two things together make this maybe a D, something you only play after a Trainwreck draft. Even if you have a bunch of merfolk, I don't actually think she gets super exciting. Basically, you will make your opponent unload one of their removal spells in Kepala to get rid of the effect, or in the late game they can just spend the extra mana. If your deck has a lot of merfolk, it does get into the C range, and that's certainly playable, but I don't think it really gets any higher than that. You're not really like getting there by having a Kepala in your merfolk deck. It's a nice bonus, but it's not going to really like make your deck a lot better. Next, we have Lookout's Dispersal, which for 2 generic and a blue is an instant that says Lookout's Dispersal costs 1 less to cast if you control a pirate, and it says counter target spell unless its controller pays 4, and it's an uncommon. I'm not a big fan of counter spells that let your opponent pay mana. They diminish in usefulness the longer the game goes on, and effectively, eventually become useless. In the meantime, you're also leaving up mana for an opportune time to counter something, which can be a big tempo hit on yourself if your opponent finds a way to play around that. The fact that this can be 2 mana, though, is a huge difference. It basically becomes better than Mana Leak at that point. This format also has lots of high curve creatures, so counter spells are going to be good a little longer than usual. In a deck that doesn't have a decent number of pirates, this is playable, but only if your draft went bad, which to me means it's a D. If you have several pirates, it does move into the C range. Still not anything to write home about, but picking it up mid-pack and running it seems fine. Next, we have Navigators Ruin, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon enchantment, and it says Raid. At the beginning of your instep, if you attack with a creature this turn, target opponent puts the top 4 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. I don't like this card at all. It asks your deck to operate on 2 different axes. On the one hand, you should be attacking with a creature every turn to activate Raid, but on the other, you should be playing this 3-mana enchantment that doesn't affect the board or the game in any big way, and it's actually completely blank if you can't attack. It doesn't do anything. If you're attacking with creatures every turn, you're probably going to win anyway, so running this thing seems like a bad idea. Milling does not seem super viable in this format. I'd rather just play a 3-drop creature in a deck that wants to be attacking every turn, and I'm going to give this an F to reflect that. Next, we have One with the Wind, which is 1 generic and 1 blue for an aura enchantment at common with enchant creature, and it says enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and has flying. You've probably heard me say I'm not a huge fan of auras that don't replace themselves because they open you up to easy 2-for-1s, but this aura does give a nice boost for the mana cost, so the risk is going to be worth it for some decks. It still shouldn't be played in all decks. It seems pretty nice in aggressive decks, though, a way of giving you reach in the later game. And if you have plenty of playables, you should probably cut it, but it's a D. It's not an F or anything. I'll probably play it once or twice in this format, and you probably will too. Next, we have Opt, which for 1 blue mana is a common instant that says Scry 1. And that means you get to look at the top card of your library and put that card on the bottom of your library if you want to. And it also says Draw a card. This is a card getting a lot of buzz for Modern, as it is effectively an upgrade over Serum Visions. It is less exciting and limited, especially because this set does not have a blue-red Spells Matter archetype. There's not even any prowess around. If it did, Opt would be significantly better. Still, this enables you to smooth out your draws, and that's never bad. It isn't exactly good either as a one-time effect. I think it's just a C. You'll play it in blue decks, but don't be too happy about it. Might be worth a few dollars, though, if it's a big deal in Modern, as people are predicting. Next, we have Overflowing Insight, which for 4 generic and 3 blue is a mythic rare sorcery that says target player draws 7 cards. Drawing 7 cards for 7 mana is great. Doing it at sorcery speed is a little scary, though. Anytime you spend 7 mana on a spell that does not immediately affect the board and you have your shields down, you're in danger of just dying. So those 7 cards won't do any good if you're far enough behind in the game. At parity or when you are ahead, Insight basically guarantees a win, though. Worth noting, it has the additional upside of occasionally being able to make your opponent draw the cards, so if they have 7 or fewer cards in their library, this can win you the game. Insight is difficult to cast with its triple blue cost. 2-color decks can sometimes struggle to get 3 of one of their colors, although there are treasures in this format. All in all, I like the card, but its prohibitive mana cost and being sorcery speed keeps it from being a card I will snap first pick or take over any of the better commons or uncommons in the set. If I'm a controlling blue deck, this could be a lot of fun, and I probably will first pick it at some point just because I love those 5 words, target player draws 7 cards. But in reality, it's probably about a C+. Next, we have Perilous Voyage, which for 1 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant that says return target non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand. If its converted mana cost was 2 or less, scry 2. 2 mana bounce, non-land permanent effects are always excellent. They can really end up giving you a lot of value when you bounce something during an opponent's end phase or in response to a combat trick or aura. They can just do a lot of work. This one comes with a little bit of extra value, though I do think it is somewhat counterintuitive. Frequently, with bounce spells, you want to bounce cards with higher mana cost because that slows down your opponent far more and gives you a tempo advantage. If you bounce something small with this, you can scry 2, which is a pretty nice bonus. However, I only see myself using it to bounce 2 mana things in situations where I can at least trade for a card, like if a combat trick or aura is being used on a smaller permanent creature, or if I'm desperate to draw a certain card in my library and I will be dead if I don't, since the scry 2 can dig me deeper. It is additional flexibility, but I think most of the time you don't want to be bouncing smaller things. In the end, this is a C+. It isn't quite a first pick, but I'm happy to take it relatively early. Next, we have Pirate's Prize, which for 3 generic and a blue is a common sorcery that says draw 2 cards. Create a colorless treasure artifact token with tap, sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. 4 mana to draw 2 at sorcery speed is not good, but adding the ability to make this treasure and thus synergize with some cards in the format while also providing ramp and fixing is nice. Sometimes when you cast a draw spell, what you really want to do is hit a land, and this offers you the chance to up your mana by 2, including a land you draw, to play a 6-drop on the next turn. That's not too shabby. Still, I don't think it's a great card. I will play it when I really need fixing or if I have treasure synergies, but it will get cut a lot. It's a D+. Next, we have Prosperous Pirates, which for 4 generic and a blue are a common 3/4 human pirate. When Prosperous Pirates enters the battlefield, create 2 colorless treasure artifact tokens. You know what they do at this point. They tap and sacrifice for mana of any color. 5 mana for a 3/4 is not a good rate, but this also happens to be a pirate, and it also happens to make treasure. This means the pirates will be solid in decks that care about pirates and decks that care about treasure, and it seems like a solid mid-pack pickup to me. I'm going to give it a C. It helps you fix, which is nice, always nice, and it helps you ramp, in addition to being, a bit of an overcosted body. Next, we have River Sneak, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/1 Merfolk Warrior at uncommon, and it says River Sneak can't be blocked. It also says whenever another Merfolk enters the battlefield under your control, River Sneak gets +1/+1 until end of turn. This Merfolk payoff is pretty terrible in a deck that doesn't have a decent number of Merfolk, as a 2 mana 1/1 with unblockable isn't very good. It's about a D-. However, if you can consistently make it a 2/2 or bigger, meaning your deck has a lot of Merfolk in it, it gets to be the kind of card that can kill your opponent pretty quickly. Still, I don't think it's a marquee card or anything for the Merfolk deck. It is merely a nice piece to add. I'm going to give it a C. I should probably push it up to a C+ really within the Merfolk deck. Next, we have River's Rebuke. 4 generic and 2 blue for a rare sorcery, and it says return all non-land permanents target player controls to their owner's hand. This may cost 6 mana, but you are getting your money's worth for it. You get rid of all of your opponent's permanents, while you get to keep all of yours in play. By the late game, it will be pretty hard for you not to come out ahead here. Bouncing more than 6 mana worth of permanents is easily doable, and this is definitely the kind of card that can just end the game, because you suddenly remove all of your opponent's permanents. I think this is first pickable in most packs, and basically any blue deck will play it. Aggro or control deck is happy with an effect like this. Even if you're behind, this can help you get back ahead. If you're at parity, you're going to win, and if you're ahead of your opponent, you're going to win. And that means this is an A. I'll first pick this very happily. Next, we have Run Aground. For 3 generic and a blue, it is a common instant that says, put target artifact or creature on top of its owner's library. Time ebb effects like this are far superior to bounce spells. This is because they actually cost your opponent a card, in the sense that their next draw step is not netting them a new card, just one they already had in play. When you bounce something, your opponent does not go down a card. 4 mana to bounce a creature or artifact is a pretty nice effect, and it's not really bounce, it's time ebb, I guess, especially at instant speed, and I will want one of these in basically every blue deck I draft. I think it's a C+. Next, we have Sailor of Means, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 1/4 human pirate at common, and it says, when Sailor of Means enters the battlefield, create a colorless treasure artifact token. A 3 mana 1/4 that provides ramp and fixing is nice. It can block for a while and help you drop your bigger creatures or off-color bombs or removal spells. It is also a pirate, and that's always a nice bonus. This is a C+. I'd be happy to have one in basically every blue deck I draft. Next, we have Search for Azcanta. It's our double-faced card in the cycle of double-faced cards that turn into lands in blue, and it's 1 generic and 1 blue for a legendary enchantment at rare, and it says, at the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top card of your library. You may put it into your graveyard. Then, if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, you may transform Search for Azcanta, and it transforms into Azcanta the Sunken Ruin. It can tap for blue mana, or you can pay 2 generic and a blue to look at the top 4 cards of your library. You can then reveal a non-creature, non-land card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. So just to search for Azcanta part of this is almost like you get to scry every upkeep, which isn't the worst thing ever. You can kind of get rid of cards that you don't want. And scry 1 every upkeep is actually a pretty good effect. It does eventually transform, and once it transforms, it has a powerful effect, allowing you to sift through cards and look for non-creature, non-land cards. Obviously, I think this is going to be at its best in a control deck that runs a lot of removal and a lot of card draw spells, because if you're just going to whiff looking at the top 4 cards of your library, then what's the point, really? I mean, there's not really any good idea. That doesn't seem like a good idea to me at all. Because it's a little more narrow, I don't think this is like a card you'd necessarily want to first pick. It is a fun build around, but I think basically it's a C+. If you really get there and you have a ton of instants and sorceries and enchantments in your deck, it can certainly be even better than that, but most of the time I just don't. Next, we have Shaper Apprentice, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 Merfolk Wizard at common, and it says, Shaper Apprentice has flying as long as you control another Merfolk. 2 mana for a 2/1 is bad, probably like a D- in limited, so if you have no other Merfolk, the only reason you play this out is out of desperation for 2 drops. However, if your deck is Merfolk heavy, this card improves all the way to the C+ range, because having a creature who can fly in the later part of the game, or the earlier part of the game for that matter, is pretty nice and keeps the creature relevant even in the late game. This is a solid common payoff for Merfolk decks, and being a Merfolk itself is quite nice. Next, we have Shipwreck Lunar, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common human pirate and a 2/1, and it has the raid ability. And it says, when Shipwreck Lunar enters the battlefield, if you attack with a creature this turn, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. So this looter actually loots. Another 2 mana 2/1. This is obviously quite underwhelming if you can't trigger raid. With raid, it does get to be better, allowing you to loot. The floor of the card being a 2 mana 2/1 isn't the worst, but yeah, you're usually going to want to be able to trigger raid with this. I think it's a C. I can see myself cutting it a decent amount of the time. Next, we have Shorekeeper, which is 1 blue mana for a 0/3 creature, a trilobite creature at common, and for 7 generic and a blue, you can tap it and sacrifice it to draw 3 cards. This is blue's version of the cycle of creatures who are all 1 mana, and they do something for 8 mana and sacrificing themselves in the late game. And this is my personal favorite of this cycle. Don't confuse that with that actually being good, though. It's kind of useless in the early game, only providing some blocks of smaller creatures. In the late game, if you're flooding out, it isn't a bad draw since drawing 3 is so nice, but basically the Keeper is only good in the late game, and really only if you're ahead or at parity. This is a D+, one that I will probably play more than I should, though, but you don't have to make the same mistake. Pretty weird they decided to use the trilobite creature type for the first time ever on this thing. I mean, I know it goes with the dinosaur theme, but that's just sort of an interesting flavor aside. On to the next card. Next, we have Siren Lookout, which is 2 generic and a blue for a creature, Siren Pirate at common, who's a 1/2 with flying, and it says, when Siren Lookout enters the battlefield, it explores. And this means you get to reveal the top card of your library, you get to put it into your hand if it's a land, and you put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, and put the card back or into your graveyard if it's not a land. I'm a pretty big fan of the aggressively costed creatures with Explore. Anytime both modes seem like a good deal, I'm in on playing them, and Siren Lookout is one of the best. A 3 mana 2/3 with flying, plus card selection, or a 3 mana 1/2 with flying and draw a card. I'd play either of those and be happy. This is one of Blue's best commons, and I think it is even first pickable in some weak packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next, we have Styrons Storm Tamer, which for 1 blue mana is a 1/1 Siren Pirate Wizard at uncommon, and it has flying. And for 1 blue, you can sacrifice it to counter target spell or ability that targets a creature or you. An effect like this is pretty good. It gives your opponents headaches about what they should do with their removal spells, since the Storm Tamer can just keep getting in the way, assuming you have 1 blue mana. I mean, I guess not keep, they sacrifice themselves. It doesn't hurt that the Siren is also a pirate, or that is a 1/1 with flying. The latter means it is good at triggering raid in the early game. So this card has a lot going on, and it is something I will never cut from blue decks, and I think it's almost in the B range, but for now I'm going to leave it at C+. Next, we have Sirens Roos, which for 1 generic into blue is a common instant that says, exile target creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. If a pirate was exiled this way, draw a card. The main place to use this is to abuse enter the battlefield triggers. As we've seen, many creatures with raid actually have an enter the battlefield trigger, and many of them also happen to be pirates. That's going to be a nice way to use this card. You can also use it to help a creature avoid removal. This will really only be worth it though in very specific decks, those with a lot of into the battlefield abilities to take advantage of, and pirates, and that's just not going to happen all the time. I'm going to give it a D, with the caveat that sometimes it can come up pretty big. Blue has yet another reprint next in Spell Pierce. For 1 blue mana, it is a common instant that says counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 2. This card is usually pretty good in the early game when you can use it to protect creatures from removal, but its usefulness diminishes as the game goes on since your opponent can eventually pay 2 extra mana with ease. This is like a D in the main board. Play it if you have to, but I think it is a good sideboard card for when you run into someone who has tons of removal, especially more expensive removal or board sweepers, and I'm going to say it's like a B sideboard card. I'd be happy to have it in the sideboard of every blue deck I draft. Next we have Spell Swindle, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a rare instant, and it says, counter target spell, create X colorless treasure artifact tokens, where X is that spell's converted mana cost. Yet another counterspell. This one is a hard counter, but it also costs 5, so leaving mana up can be pretty punishing. Still, it comes with an additional powerful effect, giving you a bunch of treasure. This sort of gets around the fact that maybe you left this mana up and didn't get to do anything with it the first time. It sort of gets you back to where you would have been if your opponent hadn't played around Spell Swindle. There are lots of treasure payoffs running around in this set too, and the fixing and ramp this provides aren't any joke either. Still, the high mana cost and the risk of an opponent playing around it doesn't make this a great card, but it's a fine one for blue decks that I'm going to give a C to. Next we have Water Trap Weaver, which is 2 generic and 1 blue for a 2/2 Merfolk Wizard at common, and it says, when Water Trap Weaver enters the battlefield, tap target creature an opponent controls. That creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. This is a pretty good card. Tapping down a creature is great for aggressive decks. That's what blue seems to be in this format. Blocking them down for 2 turns is good. It can even be good when you're behind. It's the kind of creature that's good at all stages of the game, and for me that makes it enough for it to be a C+, and it may even push into the B- range by the time this format is all said and done. Next we have Stormfleet Aerialist, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/2 human pirate at uncommon. It has flying, and it has raid. Stormfleet Aerialist enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it if you attacked with a creature this turn. A 2-mana 1/2 with flying is already something that is borderline playable. Once you throw in the fact that this is a pirate, and with the raid mechanic, it can be a 2/3 for 2 mana, this gets to be quite good. Now, being able to actually trigger raid on your turn 2 is far from a guarantee, but the nice thing about creatures with flying is that they are good for the whole game usually. So even if you get to play this as a 2/3, on turn 3 or 4, you're still feeling pretty good. Maybe on turn 4, it's low cost, lets you play another creature. Overall, I would say this is a C+. I'm happy to start taking it 4th or 5th pick or so. Next, we have Stormfleet Spy, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 human pirate at uncommon, and it has raid. When Stormfleet Spy enters the battlefield, if you attack with a creature this turn, draw a card. A 3-mana 2/2 that draws you a card is a card that I want to play all day long, and that's probably just a straight up B. And this isn't quite that good as you have to trigger raid to draw the card. Still, being a pirate adds some more to the card, and like the Aerialist, this is basically good at all stages of the game, so even if you're playing this on turn 5, you feel pretty good about it. I'm going to give it a B-. Next, we have Storm Sculptor, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 3/2 Merfolk Wizard, and it says Storm Sculptor can't be blocked. It's also a common, by the way. And it says when Storm Sculptor enters the battlefield, return a creature you control to its owner's hand. Unblockability is always nice and is a good way to make your opponent feel helpless. This does force you to return a creature to your hand, but you can make it so that's less of a downside by bouncing a card with an enter the battlefield ability, like creatures who make treasure or have raid abilities. Speaking of raid, this can also endlessly supply you with raid triggers since your opponent can never block it. It also happens to be a merfolk, which is an additional bonus. It's still pretty overcosted, and returning a creature to your hand for value isn't always going to work, so I don't think it's an amazing card or anything, but I do think it's a solid C. Next, we have Tempest Collar, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a 2/3 Merfolk Wizard at uncommon, and it says when Tempest Collar enters the battlefield, tap all creatures target opponent controls. So, speaking of the battlefield abilities, Tempest Collar has a good one. Casting the collar will frequently signal the end of a game if your board is built up at all. If you can find a way to use this trigger more than once, you're really in business. Any aggressive deck would be happy to have this effect, and blue, which is one of the colors that has the most raid in it, and thus is actually an aggressive color in this format, will be pretty happy to play Tempest Collar, and I think this is a reasonably high pick, and I'm going to give it a B-. Next, we have Windstrider, which for 4 generic and a blue is a 3/3 Merfolk Wizard at common with flash and flying. Flash is nice. It enables you to leave up mana for counter magic or removal, and if things don't occur in such a way that you have to use those, you can just cast your creature. You can also flash in creatures to kill other creatures. Killing a 2/2 with this sounds pretty nice, for example. Still, this is a bit expensive, and I think overall kind of underwhelming. Unless you were a favorable wins deck, I think this gets cut a lot. I'm going to give it a D. That does it for all the blue cards in Ixalan. Tomorrow I will return with all of the black cards in Ixalan. Just a reminder that you can head over to 5colorcombo.com, and on their website you can draft, you can practice drafting. They also have an app, and my limited ratings from these videos are used to help determine how the AI picks cards, so it's pretty realistic. So head over there and check that out.